Really, I'm the warm-up act, and I get to the principal speakers as a moment. And as the warm-up act, I have to, first of all, start the timer, which tells me exactly when I can stop being the warm-up act and pass you over to the serious things. As part of the warm-up, let me ask you a question. Are you happy? Now, this next part is an experiment. If you're happy and you know it, clap your hands. Now, if this experiment's going to work, you have to not only clap when I clap, but you have to sing when I sing. Are you up for that? If you're happy and you know it, clap your hands. If you're happy and you know it, clap your hands. If you're happy and you know it, and you really want to show it, if you're happy and you know it, clap your hands. Well, we did that with 1,700 Italian senior high school students in the Vatican a couple of months ago, and they were louder than you. But I think you did just about as well per capita. What converts this into science is I now ask you, are you happier than you were 2 minutes ago? This is always gambling a bit at this point. If the answer is a resounding no, then the hook comes out and I disappear off to the side. The point of it is that I've demonstrated two things. One, you knew what I was asking and you knew how to answer. I was asking about the emotion of happiness, and you knew this was something that could be calibrated and changed quite quickly. It's one of a set of measures of positive affect. There's a much larger frequently used set of questions on negative affect that everybody is familiar with. Our program is about introducing these positive elements of affect much more centrally into all the caring sciences and the social sciences more generally. Those two measures of affect are covered by an umbrella notion of when we ask another happiness question. It can be asked as a happiness question: how happy are you with your life as a whole? It can be asked, think of your life as a ladder, with the worst possible life as a 0 and the best as a 10. How do you rate your life today? Or how satisfied are you with your life as a whole? After 10 or 15 years of dealing with these different questions, the science has now settled that, in fact, all three of those life evaluations are structurally equivalent. They have different means and distributions, but in fact, they tell the same story about what produces a better life. Now, I'm spending a lot of time on that question because in order to convince you that what we're doing is right, to essentially use these measures of subjective well-being as a way of evaluating and convincing people of the importance of the social structure and content of life, then you have to sort of be brought along to a certain stage. These questions are now asked, these life evaluation questions, of 1,000 people a year in more than 160 countries. And so we now know much more than was ever possible to be known before about what makes for a better life. And this is quite powerful because, as Denise suggested before, it shows quite systematically, first of all, that there are very big differences across countries. So the first thing we have to start is measuring this is a kind of a truism, isn't it? If you don't measure something, it won't be taken importantly. And if it has to be not just measures, but it has to be measured and out there. And so this is a good part of, it's an important part of what we do. It's not the major part, is in fact getting these data collected all over the world, understood all over the world, and known about all over the world. Without all three of those, we won't get much further. Oh, my backhand needs work. So this is, you may not be able to read this, but I've essentially taken the top 10 countries in the World Happiness Report update of 2016, which is where the Roman high school students got to sing, and the bottom 10. First of all, you see they're very different levels of subjective well-being. If you don't take the happy peasant line very seriously and still realize this, that these average values in the bottom 10 are less than half those in the top 10, The blue bar is the value of happiness in dystopia, plus or minus a country residual. Dystopia is the level of life satisfaction you'd have if you had the world's lowest value of each of the 6 variables we used. Now we focus on the 6 variables and saying, relative to the country that's worst off in that variable, how much better off are you in life evaluation through your GDP per capita in the yellow, social support in the red, having someone to count on in times of trouble, healthy life expectancy in the blue, freedom to make key life choices in whatever that color is, explained by generosity in the purple, perceptions of corruption in gray, and as I already said, dystopia is 2.33. That's what you'd be. It isn't that your life satisfaction would disappear, but that's where it would be in the least happy country. The actual least happy country is down here at 2.9, so you can see Burundi is pretty close to being the world bottom in everything. So you add up each of those bars, that tells you what this model, explanatory model we developed, explains of the international difference. It explains about 3/4 of those differences. And you can see income per capita is a big part of the story between the richest country and the poorest countries. That's not because it's the most important variable, it's because it's the most unequally distributed across countries of all of those 6 variables. And so hence it gets more power explaining differences across countries than it does, for example, among states in Australia. Okay, this is nice. Alex helped me to put this one together. You're reading this as I'm going along, following the bouncing ball. Neat, eh? Alex, the reason he's a headline speaker and I'm the warm-up speaker is that he's a master of preparing these PowerPoints. He'll get ones that'll create enormous things. There we are. Now, this is work by your own Katie Greenaway, and I just love it because this tells you 2 things. Trust is enormously important. This is focused by, there are 2 key items here. These people were all given the same instructions, but they were primed, on the one hand, by instructions saying these instructions were written by somebody in the same artificial category of thinker as you, and this was somebody in the other artificial category. And you can see how one car is noticeably better than the other. For people who make cars, this is important. Trust is not only important for the person's own life evaluation, it does, as you can see here, make a better car. The second important thing, this is enough for me, I can go home at this stage, but if I don't get a chance to go home yet, I say the brilliant part of Katie's and her colleagues' paper was to say, we're now going to construct a superordinate identity in which these people who were in an us-them distinction are now made part of a bigger us. And what happened? The difference between the cars disappeared. So first of all, that shows you, as social psychologists have known forever, it's easy to create distinctions between us and them. What we're now learning is how easy it is to erase those distinctions and make the bigger us. And of course, to make a better world requires that being done and not just talked about. So here's another example of what happens if, in fact, there's a possibility of creating a superordinate identity. In this case, in the Canadian case, it's for immigrants, a model of integration of the sort that John Barry was talking about in the previous conference. And this paper was written to trash the set point theory. And you're not going to take these happiness data seriously if you think everybody is born with a level of happiness and they carry it around, they get jogged off it by a marriage or winning a lottery or breaking a leg, and they come back where they were at the end of that period. Well, if that was true, if you move someone from one country to another, they'd end up being just as happy in the new country as in the old country once they got over the stresses or pleasures of finding bigger grocery stores and the stress of moving. Well, look at that. If they all had on the set point, they'd be on the 45-degree line. They're essentially on a flat line, which is the average level of well-being in Canada. So this is telling you, A, that life circumstances are what determines people's life evaluations. And in fact, if they're all in the same boat, it doesn't matter which place they started from. If they're in the same Canada and feel it as their Canada, then in fact you'll expect to find that flat line. Now for something on trust. The encompassing social identities, which I argued were part of the Canadian model for immigration, and were clearly underlying recovering that badly built car and making it a well-built car, can be mapped in part, and it's dependent on a notion of trust. In this well-being literature, we find it enormously important to explain trust and see where it comes from and what it can do. And the answer is it's very important. And I'm going to give you some evidence that I think is uniquely important because it's beyond trust in the sense of will someone do what they say they're going to do. So wallets were dropped all over the world initially and returned, and it turned out the propensity of people to return wallets was mapped by answers across countries to a question, do you think people in general can be trusted, or you can't be too careful in dealing with people? Well, subsequently, some of my skeptical colleagues said, that's so airy-fairy, wishy-washy. What we want is an actual behavioral question. We want to get people to forecast something. So we asked the question in Canada first, and it's in major Canadian surveys, and now it's in fact been asked only once by Gallup in its world poll around the world. If you dropped a wallet with $200 in it, how likely is it to be returned if found by a neighbor, a stranger, a police officer, or a clerk in a local store? So then some Canadian newspaper decided to drop 20 wallets in Toronto. Well, the problem with trust is, right, I say you really want to trust people. There's lots of evidence of trusting people, but what if you trust them too much and you get your legs cut off at the knees? So you could be too trusting, right? To be trusting in an environment that doesn't deserve it. So to separate the Pollyannas from the people who think everything is a risk and nothing is worth trying, you need some evidence about how trustworthy is the world in which we live. So this is the first time there's ever been evidence that allowed you quite precisely to measure how trustworthy the world is and then ask people precisely the same question. How trustworthy do you think it is? Because, of course, what makes you happy is how trustworthy you think it is. And if you're being too pessimistic about the world, A, you won't reach out to other people. You might even be less likely to return lost wallets, and you will be less happy. So it's a big deal if the real world is better than the world you think it is. Well, look, this was the proportion of wallets returned. That was the survey proportion that people thought, very tight because it's a huge sample. This one's not so tight because there are only 20 wallets dropped. But that's the reason. 80% of those wallets were returned. The expected return was 25%. The probability of those two being the same, in other words, the world you live in be as untrustworthy as the world you think you live in, is about 1 in 8 billion. And so one of the things we're trying to do is get people to do these kind of surveys all over the world. Obviously, it's going to be culturally dependent how big that gap is. And once you know it, then you can, with some assurance, go out and tell people, for goodness sakes, stop driving your kids to school and all the other things you do because of fear. You have to, in fact, realize the world is a much better place than you think it is. Now, the wallet is very nice because it isn't just about honesty. It's got the three big components of just what we're trying to study and build. It's empathy, it's generosity, and it's other regarding behavior. So it's much more than just being honest, right? It's saying, I'm going to step out of my life with no return for me to make other people's lives better. So it's a primary, so people are not just more honest than you think they are, they're much more generous than you think they are. I get all choked up when I do that. Oh, just a sec. Okay. I'm doing astonishingly well on time. Usually I get so caught up in one of my stories that if I have any slides out there, they just have to be left for homework. I'm shifting gears now. I've tried to tell you that it's really important to measure and understand subjective well-being, and then when you do, you find that generosity and trust are absolutely fundamental supports for that, and they both have to be understood better and spread better. Getting back to the broad measurement, we want at each point to get these data integrated more directly into the kind of things people look at. So the World Bank is putting together a big series of wealth estimates for the world. And they're saying, well, because we include natural capital more fully and human capital more steadily, they'll be more stable and fundamental and sustainable and GDP accounts that bounce up and down. In fact, they have roughly the same kind of stuff in them with roughly the same kinds of movement. But then we said, because we now think we understand subjective well-being, and we now had 3 large surveys, we could value what we call social capital when we're putting them into these world wealth accounts. But it's in fact based on precisely what I was telling you about, this social trust question asked in 1 year, not the wallet question, but the social trust question, general, can people be trusted, throughout the world. And then we were able to show in individual lives how much they value that feeling of trust compared to how much they value their income, and we can do it at the individual level or the national level, and the answers are equally convincing from both. We took a very low-ball estimate, lowest from all the models, said, well, let's add that to wealth, see what it looks like. So here's what you find. These are the trust levels. Look, on a scale of 10, they were less than 1 in some countries and up to over 6 in other countries. That's on a scale of 10, which is a smart way to do it. And you can see they're very different percentages of total wealth. Of course, what percentage they'll be will depend on income as well as the level of trust, as you can see, but there's a huge variation across countries. So you can get a map that shows it, and there's some selected countries that my World Bank co-authors have put together, but you can see it's generally true in these countries that countries with less of other things also have less of trust, and that's sort of understandable in the sense that a lot of the institutions that support higher levels of health and wealth actually support people's interactions as well, but huge differences as you saw in the preceding graph. Well, I've got 20 seconds left, and I could sing a song, but I'm not going to. I'm going to, I'm going to call the chair back to introduce Alex, who's coming. Oh, it's Phil next. Well, they're both wonderful. Phil, I'm going to use those 4 seconds to say, Phil used to talk about the economics of education, and the way to get better students was to give them points for better grades. Wait and see what he has to tell you what the truth really is. Thank you.